What if I told you that America's most critical push in Normandy, the massive offensive known as Operation Cobra, was on the brink of catastrophic failure before it even began, and that the man who saved it wasn't some four-star general in a clean tent, but a 9-year-old sergeant from New Jersey with a crazy idea, an idea that involved welding German trash right onto the front of their Sherman tanks. This isn't just a war story. This is the story of how a forgotten genius used the enemy's own weapons against them to break a bloody stalemate and save thousands of American lives. Let's set the scene. It's July 1944. 6 weeks have passed since D-Day, and the Allied invasion of France is dangerously bogged down. The problem isn't the beaches anymore, it's the terrain just beyond them. The Norman bocage. And let me be clear, when soldiers said hedgerows, they weren't talking about your grandma's garden hedges. These were monstrous, ancient walls of earth, packed solid over centuries, some standing 12 feet high and 4 feet thick, all snarled together with the gnarled roots of 100-year-old trees. They were earthen fortresses, thousands of them, turning Normandy into a deadly, green maze. For the American tankers of the First Army, it was a special kind of hell. Their M4 Sherman tanks, so effective in open country, were becoming steel coffins in the bocage. The doctrine was to try and crawl over these hedgerows. But when a Sherman nosed up that steep, earthen ramp, it exposed its soft, vulnerable underbelly just 1 inch of steel, protecting the crew, the engine, and the ammunition. And waiting on the other side, hidden in the dense foliage, were German soldiers with Panzerfausts and 88mm anti-tank guns. They didn't even have to be good shots. They just had to wait for that belly to appear. The result was a sickeningly familiar nightmare. A flash, an explosion, and another Sherman, brewed up, consumed by flames so intense that crews often burned before they could even think of bailing out. In just 6 weeks, over 400 Shermans were lost. The math was simple and brutal. At this rate, advancing just 20 miles would take 6 months and cost thousands more lives. The great breakout, Operation Cobra, was doomed. In the middle of this bloody frustration was Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Cullen was no fancy West Point engineer. He was a regular guy, a cavalryman who was sick and tired of watching his friends die in preventable ways. He watched tanks try to blast their way through with explosives, only to barely dent the earth and draw a rain of German artillery. He saw crews weld extra track links to their hulls, a desperate act that did nothing against a Panzerfaust from 10 yards away. He witnessed the futility of ramming the hedgerows at full speed, which only buried the tanks nose first into 500 years of compacted French soil. The army brass was stumped. The engineers were out of ideas. Morale was plummeting. The solution, it turned out, wasn't going to come from a briefing room. It was going to come from the frustrated ranks. One sweltering afternoon, during a break, a young private from Tennessee named Roberts, likely exasperated, blurted out something to the effect of, "What we need is some kind of saw teeth on the front of these things to chew through the roots." Most of the guys probably chuckled or ignored him, just another soldier venting. But Sergeant Cullen listened. He didn't hear a complaint. He heard the spark of an idea. Saw teeth, prongs, something to dig in, not climb over. His mind immediately went to the beaches. Just weeks before, those same beaches had been littered with thousands of German anti-invasion obstacles, specifically the ones called Czech hedgehogs, 3 massive beams of railway steel welded together into a giant menacing jack. Their purpose was to rip open the hulls of Allied landing craft. Now, they were just junk, pushed into massive scrap heaps by army engineers, German trash. But Cullen saw something else. He saw potential. He saw the very steel meant to slaughter Americans on the beaches being repurposed to save them inland. It was a beautiful, powerful irony. Grabbing a simple K-ration box, he began to sketch. No blueprints, no complex calculations, just a soldier's practical mind at work. He envisioned taking the toughest steel beams from those hedgehogs, cutting them into tusks, and welding them to the front of a tank. The angle had to be just right, angled forward and down. The theory was simple. When the tank hit the hedgerow, these steel tusks wouldn't try to climb it. They would slam into the base, digging deep into the packed earth and severing the ancient root systems like a giant plough. The tank would punch through the wall, not over it, keeping its vulnerable belly protected. He convinced his superiors to let him try. Working with a maintenance crew, he took 4 sections of the heavy German steel and welded them to the bow of a light M5 Stuart tank. The device was crude, ugly, and built from literal battlefield refuse. 7 times they tested it on a light tank. 7 times the Stuart tank burst through a hedgerow. It had no business challenging. The proof of concept was there, but the real test was yet to come. The next step was to see if this contraption could work on a full-sized 33-ton Sherman, more than double the weight. The forces involved would be immense. The welds could shear off. The tank's bow plate could be ripped apart. The entire tank could even flip forward. The stakes were getting higher, and word was starting to travel up the chain of command. A sergeant from New Jersey was playing with German scrap metal, and he might have just stumbled upon the key to unlocking all of Normandy. The moment of truth arrived. A full-weight, 33-ton Sherman, commanded by a brave lieutenant named Charles Green, was fitted with the 320-pound, 4-pronged assembly. The extra weight made the tank sit heavy on its front suspension, a detail that seemed minor at the time, but would soon become a major headache. On July 12th, Green and his crew ran 5 separate tests. 5 times, the Sherman slammed into a dense hedgerow, and 5 times it tore straight through. The welds held. The bow plate didn't buckle. The concept was sound. Word of the successful tests shot up the chain of command like a flare in the night, straight to the top. General Omar Bradley, commander of the entire U.S. First Army. Bradley was a pragmatic, no-nonsense general, and he was desperate. He had a massive offensive, Operation Cobra, scheduled for July 25th, and he knew it would be a massacre if his tanks couldn't get through the bocage. He ordered a personal demonstration for the next morning. So, at 9:42 a.m., on July 13th, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Cullen stood near a dusty Norman road, his heart likely pounding in his throat. He watched as General Bradley, the man holding the fate of 1 million soldiers in his hands, stepped out of a jeep. There was no pomp and circumstance. Bradley simply pointed at a monster of a hedgerow 200 yards away, 12 feet high, thick as a fortress wall, the exact kind of obstacle that had been bleeding his army dry for 42 days. Lieutenant Green's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional. Ready to demonstrate, Bradley raised his binoculars. Proceed. The Sherman's engine roared to life. It lurched forward, picking up speed 15, 20, 25 miles per hour. It charged the earthen wall. The impact was visceral, a sound like a freight train collision that echoed across the fields. Dirt and rock exploded upwards. The tank's nose dipped violently as the steel tusks bit into the earth. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, the 33-ton machine strained against 500 years of compacted earth and root systems. The engine screamed, the tracks churned, and then, with a final groaning tear, the hedgerow collapsed inward. The Sherman burst through to the other side, 14 seconds from start to finish. A stunned silence fell over the small group of officers. Bradley slowly lowered his binoculars. He walked over to the fresh gap in the ancient wall, a wound torn open in the landscape. He touched the torn earth, examined the thick, severed roots. He then turned to his staff, his expression unreadable. He looked at Sergeant Cullen, this enlisted man who had just solved a problem that had baffled an army of engineers, and he asked a simple, earth-shattering question. How many of these can we produce? An officer from Ordnance replied that the existing scrap heaps of German beach obstacles could probably yield about 500 devices. Bradley's response was immediate and absolute. I want 3,000. That order wasn't a request. It was a thunderclap that kicked off one of the most frantic, desperate production races of the entire war. Operation Cobra was just 12 days away. To meet Bradley's demand, the ordnance crews would need to modify 3,000 armoured vehicles, Shermans, light tanks, and tank destroyers. The math was horrifying. That's 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, 1 tank every 6 minutes, around the clock, for 12 straight days. For an improvised device that had, until yesterday, only existed in a sergeant's sketch on a ration box, the honeymoon was over. Culin's genius idea now slammed into a wall of brutal, unforgiving reality. A production site was hastily set up in a field near the village of Colombières. Captain James Dupuy of the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived with the first wave of 30 welders. They immediately hit their first major snag. The German steel from the hedgehogs was incredibly tough, far harder than standard American steel. The cutting torches they used would overheat and fail after just 20 minutes of trying to slice through the stubborn metal. The first day's frantic effort yielded a pathetic 8 completed devices, 8 tanks, out of 3,000. At that rate, they wouldn't be ready for Cobra. They'd be lucky to be done by Halloween. Culin, now acting as a technical advisor, troubleshot the production line. He realized the issue was heat dissipation. He organized the welders into rotation shifts, one team cutting while another's equipment cooled down. Production crept up to 22 devices on the second day. Still a disaster. More welders were brought in, 40 more, pulled from maintenance battalions all over Normandy. By July 17th, 8 days before the offensive, production hit 38 devices per day. The brutal math still mocked them. Then, a second crisis. The 320-pound weight of the Rhino device, as it was now nicknamed, was putting immense strain on the Sherman's front suspension. After repeated impacts on test vehicles, the springs showed stress fractures. A broken suspension in the middle of combat would turn a tank into a sitting duck, a death trap. Culin had to redesign the mounting system on the fly, creating reinforcement brackets to distribute the weight more evenly across the hull's frame. The fix worked, but it added another 30 precious minutes to each installation. The field at Colombières transformed into a vision of industrial hell. It looked like a Detroit factory had been dropped into the French countryside. Welders worked through the night under the harsh glare of floodlights powered by mobile generators. The constant screech of metal being cut and the hiss of welding torches became a 24-hour symphony of controlled chaos. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and welding flux. Men collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping for a few hours in shifts before getting back on the line. But for Sergeant Culin, this wasn't just a logistical problem, it was a moral one. This was his invention. Every delay, every setback, every production number that fell short of the impossible goal meant more men would go into Operation Cobra without the one thing that could save their lives. Every report of an overheating torch or a fractured spring was a potential death sentence for a crew he would never meet. The weight of 3,000 tanks and the 14,000 men inside them was now resting squarely on his shoulders. He had solved the riddle of the hedgerows, but now he had to win an insane race against the clock, or his brilliant solution would mean absolutely nothing. July 25th, 1944. Dawn. For a few moments, the world held its breath in a tense, unnatural silence. Then, the ground began to tremble. On the horizon, the sky filled with planes 1,500 Allied heavy bombers, followed by thousands more medium bombers and fighter bombers. For the next 90 minutes, they unleashed a biblical storm of fire and steel, a rolling thunder of 4,000 tons of explosives on the heavily fortified German lines near Saint-Lô. From a forward observation post 3 miles back, Sergeant Culin could only watch, the earth shaking under his feet as the very air crackled with destructive power. This was the overture. The performance of his invention was about to begin. When the last bomb fell, the silence that returned was even more deafening. And into that silence, at 7:45 a.m., the tanks began to move. Imagine being one of those young tankers in the 2nd Armored Division, leading the assault. You're sitting in your cramped steel box, the smell of diesel and sweat thick in the air. For weeks, you've seen what those hedgerows do to tanks. You've had nightmares about them. But today, bolted to the front of your Sherman is this crude, ugly, 4-pronged thing. You don't know if it'll work. You don't know if the welds will hold. All you have is a rumor that some sergeant came up with it, and a prayer on your lips as your commander gives the order to advance. The first radio reports started crackling through at 8:15 a.m. They were hesitant at first, then filled with a kind of breathless disbelief. Company B reached its first objective. The lead Sherman, instead of cautiously crawling up the slope, accelerated to 25 miles per hour and slammed head-on into the earthen wall. A spray of dirt, a shudder that shook the crew, and then daylight. It had punched clean through in 16 seconds. The crew reported no damage. Then, another report. Company C had breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes, a feat that could have taken an entire day. Company A pushed through 5 consecutive lines without stopping. The pattern was repeating across the entire front. The rhinos were working. They were working spectacularly. For the German defenders, it was pure chaos. Their entire defensive strategy was built on a single, reliable assumption that American tanks had to come over the top. Their Panzerfaust teams were dug in to fire upwards. Their anti-tank guns were sighted on the predictable crests of the hedgerows. When the rhinos suddenly burst through the base of the walls at ground level, moving at speed, the German firing solutions became completely worthless. Panic began to set in. The terrain that had been their greatest ally had suddenly betrayed them. By 10:30 a.m., the 2nd Armoured Division had advanced 2 miles. 2 miles in under 3 hours, a distance that had previously cost them 3 agonizing, bloody days of fighting. But this is war. And war is never perfect. The first reports of failure started trickling in around 11 m. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow that had a massive buried stone foundation, a remnant of an ancient Roman wall. Instead of cutting through, the prongs hit the unyielding stone with a sickening crunch of bending steel. The prongs bent backward, crippling the tank. It couldn't move forward. It couldn't reverse. The crew was a sitting duck. They had to bail out under withering machine gun fire. 2 men died scrambling out. Another failure at 11:20. A light tank's prongs struck a hidden iron fence post, and the entire assembly sheared off, taking a chunk of the bowplate with it. A third failure at noon. A tank destroyer with heavier railroad prongs hit a hedge too fast, at 30 miles per hour. The impact buckled the mounting brackets, twisting the prongs sideways and jamming a track. The vehicle was immobilized. From his observation post, Kulin listened to this symphony of success and failure over the radio. Every triumphant report of a successful breach was a jolt of pride. But the failure reports, those gnawed at him. The failure rate was stabilizing at around 4%. 4% sounds small. It sounds like a success. But Kulin wasn't a statistician. He was a soldier. His mind did the grim math. 4% of the 2,300 modified tanks meant approximately 92 vehicles would fail. 92 crews, trapped and exposed. That was 460 men whose lives were endangered by the unforeseen variables he couldn't have tested for. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, impact speeds. He felt the weight of every single one. Then, at 1:30 p.m., a report came through that changed the entire emotional calculus. A battalion from the 3rd Armoured Division had reached the Marigny Street Gills Road. That was 4 miles inland. 4 miles in 6 hours, the same distance that had taken 2 full weeks of brutal, grinding combat in June. The German defensive line wasn't just being pushed back. It was collapsing. Entire units were retreating, unable to establish new defensive positions because the American armor was moving too fast, appearing in places they simply shouldn't have been able to reach. The hedgerows, those instruments of death and despair, had been reduced to mere speed bumps, delaying the American advance by 15 seconds at a time. By late afternoon, advanced elements were 5 miles inland. The stalemate wasn't just broken. It was shattered. General Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond anyone's wildest projections. The Rhino tanks had solved the bocage problem, and it was all thanks to 4 ugly prongs of German trash welded to the front of a Sherman tank. The sun set on July 25th, 1944, over a Normandy transformed. The front line had surged forward 8 miles in a single day. The brutal, grinding warfare of the bocage was effectively over. Coulin drove back from the observation post that evening, the sounds of distant, advancing artillery replacing the static crackle of the radio. He returned to the now abandoned production site at Colombières. The welding stations were silent. The field was empty, littered only with scraps of German steel and burnt-out torch tips. He sat on the hood of his jeep, utterly exhausted, and tried to process the scale of what had just happened. A simple sketch on a ration box 3 weeks ago had redrawn the map of the war in France. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. With the hedgerow defences neutralised, German units could no longer establish effective defensive lines. They were in a full, chaotic retreat. The American armour, once trapped, was now unleashed, advancing 40 miles in just 8 days. This lightning advance led directly to the encirclement of the German 7th Army, creating the infamous Falaise Pocket, where the Rhino tanks played a crucial role in blocking escape routes through the remaining bocage terrain. The stalemate that had cost so many lives was decisively broken. Captured German officers, interrogated by Allied intelligence, spoke of the devices with a mixture of shock and awe. They didn't know what to call them, referring to them as hedge devils or iron tusks. One company commander confessed that his anti-tank gun crews simply abandoned their positions and fled after watching 3 Shermans punch through of hedgerows they had considered utterly impenetrable. Sergeant Cullen's invention hadn't just defeated a physical obstacle, it had shattered the psychological confidence of the enemy. The recognition, when it came, was swift and came from the very top. In mid-August, as the Allies were closing in on Paris, a courier delivered a message to Coulin, who had been reassigned to training duties. "General Bradley wants to see you. Immediately." Cullen drove to headquarters with a knot in his stomach. All he could think about was that 4% failure rate, those 92 tanks. Was he about to be reprimanded? Was there some flaw they had discovered that he was now going to be blamed for? He was escorted into Bradley's office, where the general and several staff officers were waiting. Bradley, a man not known for emotional displays, held a folder. He gestured for Coulin to sit. The general didn't waste time with small talk. He opened the folder and slid a document across the polished wooden desk. It was an official recommendation for the Legion of Merit. "You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct," Bradley said, his voice flat but carrying immense weight. "Your hedgerow cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra." He paused, looking Cullen directly in the eye. "And saved an estimated 1,500 American lives." Coulin was stunned into silence. The Legion of Merit was the 4th highest military decoration, an award typically reserved for high-ranking officers for their contributions to an entire campaign. For a sergeant to receive it for what was, essentially, a field modification, was almost unheard of. "Sir," Coulin managed to stammer, I just welded some steel to tanks." Bradley almost smiled. "Sergeant, you solved a tactical problem that had stopped the First Army cold for 6 weeks. Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name." He then added the ultimate validation. "The device is now officially designated the Cullen Hedgerow cutting device in Army records. You earned this." The ceremony took place on August 20th in a field near Saint-Lô, the very town whose capture had been made possible by his invention. General Bradley himself pinned the medal to Cullen's uniform. It was a simple ceremony, attended by about 200 soldiers, but among them were men who owed their lives to him. During Cobra, his crew had breached 47 hedgerows without a single casualty. He shook Cullen's hand, a gesture of gratitude that likely meant more than any medal. The official citation credited Cullen with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill. It noted the production of over 2,800 devices and the estimated reduction in casualties. The news spread. The British and Canadian armies quickly requested the technical specifications, producing hundreds of their own versions. An improvised solution born of desperation on a Norman field had become standard Allied military doctrine in a matter of weeks. The kid from New Jersey who got tired of watching his friends die had become one of the most consequential, yet unsung, heroes of the Normandy campaign. His simple, brilliant idea had not only won a battle, it had changed the course of the war in Europe. When the guns finally fell silent and the ticker-tape parades were over, Sergeant Curtis Cullen came home. Like millions of other GISers, he took off the uniform and quietly tried to piece a normal life back together. There was no victory tour, no lucrative book deal, no consulting contract with the Pentagon. He moved to New York City, married the love of his life, and got a regular 9-to-5 job with a liquor company. The man whose mind had saved an army now concerned himself with production schedules and distribution routes. He lived quietly, never seeking the spotlight, a ghost of his own monumental achievement. But the war had left its own cruel, indelible mark on him, a postscript of profound irony. A few months after the triumph of Operation Cobra, while fighting in the brutal, bloody slog of the Hurtgen Forest campaign, Curtis Cullen's vehicle struck a mine. The man who had invented a device to protect the bellies of tanks and save thousands of his comrades from being torn apart, lost one of his own legs in the blast. He returned home not just as a humble hero, but as a wounded one, a quiet man who now carried the physical scars of the conflict in addition to its memories. This perhaps explains his silence more than anything. He had seen enough, done enough, and lost enough. He just wanted peace, and so his story began to fade. The world moved on. The headlines were dominated by bigger, more earth-shaking events. The atomic bomb, the surrender of Japan, the dawn of the Cold War. A sergeant's clever invention from a single battle in France, no matter how critical, became a historical footnote, a piece of trivia for military history buffs. General Bradley tried to keep the memory alive. In his 1951 memoirs, A Soldier's Story, he dedicated several pages to the bocage problem and credited Cullen by name, calling his device absurdly simple and utterly brilliant. It caused a small ripple of renewed interest, but it wasn't enough to make Curtis Cullen a household name. He lived out his days in relative anonymity in Greenwich Village, a regular guy on a regular street. On November 20th, 1963, Curtis Grubb Cullen passed away at the tragically young age of 48. His local obituary mentioned his Legion of Merit, but few who read it could possibly grasp the full weight of his contribution. It seemed his story would be buried with him. But then, something remarkable happened. Less than a year after his death, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day in June 1964, the legendary CBS newsman Walter Cronkite sat down for a televised interview with a man Cullen knew well. General, now President, Dwight D. Eisenhower. They were filming on location, standing in an actual field in Normandy, the ancient hedgerows still looming behind them. Cronkite asked the former Supreme Allied Commander about the stalled breakout from the beaches. And on national television, Eisenhower, the architect of the entire invasion, told America the story. He didn't talk about grand strategy or famous generals. He talked about a sergeant. He described the impossible problem of the hedgerows, and then he said, "There was a little sergeant, Sergeant Cullen, who figured this out." With those simple words, spoken by his former commander-in-chief to millions of viewers, the forgotten man was resurrected. The footnote became a legend. Curtis Cullen wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution was finally etched into the permanent memory of the nation he had served so well. Today, the modern legacy of his invention exists in 3 places. You can see M4 Sherman tanks fitted with his Rhino device in museums like the National World War II Museum, but his most important legacy isn't behind glass. It's in the living doctrine of the U.S. military, the Cullen principle that a tactical solution can come from any rank, using available materials is still taught today. It was there in the deserts of Iraq, when soldiers welded scrap metal, what they called hillbilly armor, to their Humvees. It was there in the mountains of Afghanistan, when engineers improvised solutions to counter IEDs. But the truest legacy? It's incalculable. It's the 1,500 men who came home from Normandy because of his invention. Those men had children. Those children had children. The number of people alive today, walking this earth, because Curtis Cullen welded German beach trash to a tank is impossible to count. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. He never knew that. He died thinking he was just a footnote. If this story of quiet courage and ingenuity moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube that these are the stories that matter, the ones that need to be seen. And hit subscribe, then turn on all notifications. We're on a mission here, rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about the sergeants, the mechanics, and the ordinary soldiers who saved lives with scrap steel, courage, and a flash of genius. And now for the most important part. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Curtis Cullen's story doesn't disappear into silence again. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.